Hey, Mossy, how you doing? Don't mind me just doing a little update super fast, making sure I have the correct music inside of the details before we go live. I hope everyone's doing well today. I'm going to be putting out a bunch of alerts in a second. I'm currently just getting through some hot chocolate. A little too hot for me to sip right now. I already had myself a Stroop waffle, and I'm feeling good. How are you doing, Mossy? The ping explosion coming, right? Yeah. As it is. Go up here, copy these a little bit fast. Okay, I think that's everybody who needs to be credited. It's one of those little things you don't really think about until you actually start doing content creation on YouTube, that you need to be super ruthless about making sure you get everybody's proper name and proper details, like, all handled, or else you get credit. You get copyright struck. I don't need the money from this. I would love it, but the real thing I need to make sure I'm doing right is attributing where I can. Especially for Creative Commons work. These folks already do so much crazy awesome art and crazy awesome work. It would be a shame not to give credit where it belongs. Also, for anyone who's currently watching, huge shout-outs to the following content creators and incredible musicians who are going to be today on the stream. That includes Noke, who's part of the Arcadium. There is Punch Deck. There is Scott Buckley. And those are the big ones. Also Technoaxe. I always forget to throw Technoaxe there. Technoaxe makes a lot of good stuff too. So huge thanks to all those incredible artists for making their stuff all readily accessible, and namely, and probably the most importantly, all of it is Creative Commons. So thank you. You're incredible. As someone who does a lot of that, it means a ton. There we go. I just want to make sure everybody's properly pinged. Technoaxe is credited. Punch Deck is credited. Alright. Okay, I think that's everybody credited. We're updated, we're saved. I'm currently sending out all the alerts. Get ready for a flood of pings on every panel, every page you're involved in. I'll try to keep it as relatively brief as I possibly can. Alright. All the pings are out. We're doing good. And with that, I believe I can close everything down. Let me just make sure I got the lore primer open. Alrighty. And with that, need to get legacy species. Take all that and just throw this in the lore pad at the bottom. There we go. Okay, cool. So now I can close that old document and we can get to it. Thank you all so much for your patience. I am the last Omnitech, your favorite robot American, and welcome to this very special second of 8, I should say, OMNI Draws, where we will be drawing stuff for Legacy First Flight, my fast and light tale in the world of tomorrow. I hope you're all ready for a fun time, because I most assuredly am. Let me just make sure I got that right. Yeah, there we go. Heck yeah. Let's pop right on over, get our cam going. And this is why we gotta do it. It wouldn't be an art stream if there wasn't something going on. Ah, there we are. Hey everybody. Good morning. Alright, and with that, we pop on over to our canvas. And look at that, ain't that grand. You guys even gotta look at what was going on my desktop. Consider yourselves lucky. Okay, I'm gonna close all this over here. And I'm gonna make sure I loop the playlist. And with that, we should be good to go. So, what are we working on today, everybody? Well, today we're going to be working on the Anazali, who are the second of 8 species in Legacy First Flight that players can actually play as. So let me just open this up, make sure we're all good. I'll slap this over here. Nice. So that way I have a little bit more condensed. I gotta tell you, the side of my panel over here is kind of exploding. So here we go. I can close all this, set myself to Do Not Disturb, and close Discord. Gorgeous. Beautiful. Incredible. Alright. So, let's open up some old art of the Anazali so folks can know what I'm talking about. I'm going to pop this over here. So, the Anazali are one of the 8 playable species in Legacy First Flight. Legacy First Flight being my own Indie TTRPG setting I've been working on for like 20-odd years, give or take. What are you doing tonight? Something we do every night, Moss. Try to get Legacy finished. God, ain't that true. So, the legacy of the Anazali are interesting. They are the oldest species in Legacy, bar none. At least the oldest playable species in Legacy, bar none. As far as the galaxy goes, they're the only species that has seen the prior civilization before the Union, before everything collapsed. The Acris might have been one of the 2 founding members of the Union, but they were uplifted from their Stone Age at that era, and technically never knew the galaxy that the Anazali were fleeing from. The Anazali, on the other hand, watched as the Milky Way was overrun by the Ataraxi Scourge and saw the Imperial fall. The Imperial being their old empire. In fact, most modern Anazali, they're the descendants of those original fascistic authoritarian overlords. The actual Anazali Imperial killed almost the entirety of the Anazali, the species that used to exist in the trillions, now existing in only a pittance of a couple of million at most. Less than, I believe. We're starting to get into like the under a million count by the start of Legacy First Flight. In a galaxy with trillions of individuals, it makes them phenomenally rare and super cautious about their numbers. So the Anazali of the modern era are not the same ones who ruled the Imperial for the most part. The Ataraxi Scourge claimed most of them with their empire. These are all the refugees who fled, the children of those who made this empire. A few of them were old enough to actually remember the empire proper, but they're not particularly fond of it. They don't remember it with any sort of glee. In fact, most modern Anazali look back on the old empire and view it as exactly what it was. A failure, on many, many different fronts. And so, that's who the Anazali are. In terms of mechanically speaking, the Anazali have a couple of interesting little features. First things first, as I pop over and get a little art in here, because I have a couple of interesting little pieces. I want to make sure I get out here. Where did I slap you? Legacy species art, mayhaps? Okay, so, as far as Anazali culture goes, and Anazali clothing, the Anazali tend to wear modified flight suits, or atmospheric suits, that they used to wear on their fleet ships. This comes in many different varieties, but as a general rule of thumb, tends to be a relatively tight-fitting underbody suit, and usually some sort of gossamer overlayer, or some sort of robes or clothing. Hard light decorations are very common, but more practical Anazali will literally wear actual physical padding and plating as they need. And many Anazali, as the years have gone on, have slowly begun to change their visual aesthetic. They've begun to wear clothing that they've spun, or things that fit a more modern aesthetic of other species. The Anazali being pretty much humanoid for all intents, they actually fit a lot of human clothing pretty well. Same thing for synthetics. So, as a general rule of thumb, they share a lot of the same personal aesthetic choices. Hot cocoa. So, those are the Anazali that most people are familiar with, but they also are known for something else, which is their incredibly ancient, super dangerous technology. More than any other species in the Union, the Anazali keep secrets. Not even out of malevolence, simply out of necessity. And this is because the Anazali, at one point, were a terrifying force to be reckoned with across the galaxy. This is where we get into topics such as, the old heroes. This is an old doodle. And by old, I mean it's actually a paper sketch I started doing, actual digital art over, so it's mixed media now, several years back. I think this was actually in the 20-teens, late 20-teens, 2016 maybe, something like that, almost 10 years ago now. But it's a pretty good gauge of what an Anazali hero is. Hero is not a term that you and I would... It's a term like you and I would use lightly to describe someone who's done heroic deeds, but for the Anazali, the translation of hero is one who puts others ahead of themselves, which to them literally translates to self-sacrifice. Anazali heroes were Anazali who would weaponize themselves with extremely advanced technology, bind themselves to these super advanced warsuits, and literally would give themselves wholly over to the cause. So this specific art made me think of Zero from Borderlands. You know what's funny? I'm pretty sure I made this before I saw that. Pretty sure. I can't remember what time Borderlands... I think Zero was Borderlands 3? I think. Which one was it? It was either Borderlands 2? It was Borderlands 2. So this is 2012. So this was around the time. That sort of tracks. But yeah, the Anazali come in many different shapes and sizes, but their heroes specifically are probably the thing they're most well known for. And also the thing that they're most terrifying. Because these things are wholly unchained. Anazali heroes literally only control themselves through ruthless, brutal, super hard like focus. They are constantly grinding down their consciousness in order to maintain authority and control over these war suits that are occupied by ancient spirits. Literally, their dead stick around inside these suits, which in many ways actually, unfortunately, leads to an echoing effect. The Anazali often struggle with this, and it's a problem. Here we go. This is another image of a hero. This was drawn much more recently. I think this is a couple of years back. So, Anazali heroes are basically they're basically walking stars, more or less. A person with enough power inside of their suit to personally spacefold, which allows them to do incredible things, and effectively rig users beyond your wildest dreams. Technically, the Shrike created modern rig technology. These guys equated something far more terrifying a long time earlier. So, but yeah, this gives you an idea of what you're dealing with. At the time, the Anazali Imperial treated the heroes as a kind of, I guess, weapon of... punitive weapon, really, more than anything. A tactical, punitive weapon. They really weren't a weapon of war, because no one could really effectively wage war against the Anazali. So they were a weapon of compliance and terror. They would basically tell a hero, go to a planet, rough up its population, devastate its cities, very much like the Viltrumites do in Invincible, and then demand they subjugate themselves. If they don't, then the fleet moves in, and you really see the technological disparity of the Anazali over their old imperial, I guess the proper word would be subjects. However, that empire has long since died, and now we're left with a new age. So, let's get a little doodle going. Modern Anazali they do share a little DNA, in terms of, like, cultural anyway, with their old empire. For starters, the modern Anazali... Hold on. There. The modern Anazali struggle immensely with the pull of authoritarianism. This just comes from the very nature of their survival. The Anazali literally, in order to survive, became a fleet species. Literally surviving on just, like, very simple, rudimentary commands. And so, you have this species of super advanced extraterrestrials that have been living under martial law for millennia. And yes, I do mean millennia, because that is one of the greatest traits of the Anazali, one of the most well-known traits of the Anazali, is the fact that the Anazali, literally, they don't age. Once they hit age 30 or so, they just sort of stop. This was an adaptation they actually created for themselves. It allowed them to traverse the stars at great distance and not worry too much about the effects of superluminal travel, both for the people back at home who weren't traveling and the ones who were out and abroad. Gave them a unique edge, as it were. I'm going to copy this. We're going to paste this a couple times. There we go. And then we do a couple of slivercraft. Is this on the background layer? No, we're not doing that. Wrong layer. There we go. I was like, what the heck is going on here? Most Anazali ships to us would look like glass. Large glass daggers and needles. Might need to get a new... Yeah, I need to get myself a new tablet. I'm having issues with it registering my presses. This thing has been used non-stop for years, so I'm impressed it's lasted this long, if I'm being real with you all. Here we go. And I'm just going to take one supermassive up-close look at one of these ships. Or relatively up-close look. There we go. So that'll do. So I'm going to take all this and condense it down into one background sketch. So merge down. We're going to save all this. Beautiful. So let's get a little bit of lore about the Anazali going, huh? So we can actually, like, get a little bit of description about their culture and their civilization. So, as far as the Anazali go, if I read the actual lore of the beta pack, which I'm just going to read right off of it. Ancient and ageless, the Anazali are the last of their once proud race, and their children and the children and last survivors of a once galaxy-spanning empire. Possessed of keen minds, unbelievable longevity, and a genetically modified physiology engineered to survive space travel, the bulk of Anazali live in flotillas of ships orbiting the mantle that they once helped build, in what is now known as the Anazali Remnant. Those that venture out of the fleet often do so for specific purposes, and such as lending their significant life experience and millennia of expertise to the other peoples of the galaxy, or exploring the galaxy they once fled out of personal curiosity. The most humanoid non-humanoid species in the galaxy, the most humanoid non-human species in the galaxy, I'm having a bad time reading this morning. The Anazali are plantigrade bipeds with a straight back and a graceful gait. Their skin shades tend towards paler, cool colors, such as light grays, thistle purples, soft sky blues, incredibly pale shades of green, brown, and pink. The face of an Anazali is their most easily recognizable feature. With soft facial features, a crown of horn-like structures growing from their brows, unique to the individual, softly bioluminescent eyes with black sclera, and a pair of external mandibles, thick tendril-like hair, they are utterly unmistakable at a glance. So that gives you a pretty good gauge as to what the Anazali look like. And who they are. Now, as far as their culture goes, they've got some interesting stuff going on there, too. We should mention it. So let's do this on a new layer. Do this on a new layer. There we go. Here we are. So these massive ships are actually part of the Remnant fleet. Known as world ships, they actually carry huge numbers of Anazali across the stars. They're basically flying cities, even by the standards of other species, where their ships are kilometers in length and usually topping out at like 10 kilometers for like the hugest of superstructure craft. Anazali world ships are only sitting usually at around, I'd say about 10 to 12 kilometers in length, but utilize folded space architecture in order to actually be larger on their interior than their exterior. little Doctor Who in there, but with a slight twist on that. Unlike the TARDIS, which doesn't seem to really have any issues with keeping its shape, most Anazali craft need to be powered. If their interior tensor fields ever fail, the folded space will unfold. And when that happens, well, read explosion, literally. At this point, these ancient ships, which used to be warships, repurposed for people surviving long term, they kind of almost have their own unique internal architecture from ship to ship. No two world ships are identical. Exterior-wise, they might look very similar, but interior-wise, you have entire cities and districts, internal parks, infrastructure, all built to the unique needs of the community that lives within it. At the moment, there are currently 5 major arcs that remain of the Anazali. It also must be said that the Anazali are the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy. And that's not even close. The Acris are super advanced in terms of their understanding of how to bend light, but the Anazali are the most advanced in terms of their capacity for just general technological mastery. Truth is, their technology almost appears magical by comparison to other species. Very much the old, that old quote, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, applies wholeheartedly to the Anazali. Their technology is understandable in its function, but in its execution it seems mythical merely. It doesn't seem real to a lot of species. Machines that can predict the needs of their wielder. Objects that can bend time and space to expand or compress a needed area. Machines that can literally effortlessly transport consciousness from body to machine and wholly rearrange the molecules of the person using it, making them truly one with their machines. These are all things that the average person across the galaxy just doesn't have experience with. And never will, probably. But the Anazali also acknowledge that that technology hasn't saved them, and poses a unique danger in the age of the Union. There's this running issue the Anazali have with the idea of uplifting a species. They actually did it only with the Acris because for them, they realized that, well, they either uplift them or they probably died. So it was less of an issue of cultural pollution and more of an issue of attempting to deliver them from what was certainly an apocalypse of the Anazali's own accidental making. But as far as the rest of the Anazali know, or are concerned, there's a very strong stigma attached to uplifting a species. For starters, there's the huge ethical issues of interfering in someone's cultural development. We've all watched enough Star Trek to know that the... what is it? Prime Directive? The Prime Directive is very much a sometimes food, depending on who's actually running the show. And it's true. For the Anazali, that is a thing. But there's also the legitimate fear of their ancestors who used technological uplifting as a way to actually stratify and rob a species of independence. In the same way that if you give somebody free power, they won't build their own power stations and become dependent upon you, which means you could theoretically use it for leverage. A thing the Imperial did regularly. So as a result, many modern Anazali are very nervous about the idea of possibly uplifting other species. It's seen as a ethically dubious road. And so for the most part, the Anazali don't. General rule of thumb, the Anazali sort of will give people access to technology they've developed themselves and give them sort of the cliff notes of how the Anazali did it. Maybe let them refine the things, but refining technology is vastly different from inventing it wholesale. That's kind of where the Anazali generally fall. They will not give someone a technology they haven't already conceived of and engineered. There we go. Beautiful. So we've got our ships here now. They look pretty good. This is about what I expected most Anazali ships to sort of look like. They have that kind of structure to them. Very glass-like, very formless. I figure we'll probably have, like, this one being an Anazali looking out of a window on their fleet. And here we go. Nice. Alright, so we've got the fleet more or less done. Looks pretty good to me. Let's start working on the environment around our Anazali friend here. And we'll also do a quick little doodle over this too. So I kind of like the idea of our Anazali friend just sort of sitting here gazing out. Maybe looking a little more upwards. I'm just trying my best to do this as well as I can. I'm going to reduce the opacity of the background because I can feel it's fucking with me. So let's take our background here. Let's save this fast. I want to change the shape of that head. Doesn't look quite right to me. There we go. That looks a little better. Their skull shape is very much like a human. The way I often describe it is Anazali kind of look like humans wearing masks or helmets. If you can think of a person wearing a catcher's mask from baseball, you're about right. You're in that ballpark of like how their facial structure is. They have a sunken underface and sort of like an elevated overface where there's the bony cartilaginous plating. And we sort of have that pulled down. Here we go. Cartilaginous, good word. Thank you. Appreciate you. See, I can occasionally English. Not always, but every once in a while it happens. There we go. Okay. And then we just sort of take that, pull it down. Now, much like a lot of other animals with antlers, the Anazali's horns and mandibles actually are very dramatically distinct from one another. So, some come to a sharper point, others curve. Also, as is tradition, I made food and ate. Nice. So what you eating today, Mossy? Kind of want to pull this up a little bit more. There we go. Just a couple cheese and onion pasties with beans and cheese. Nice. Hey, if it works, right? I'm Puerto Rican. Like, bread and butter is literally my, well, bread and butter. So I understand that entirely. Alright, that works. And usually we'll have kind of like the tendrils will tend to come from around here. Here we go. Okay, that works. And we're just going to call this Anazali Recline. Yeah, Anazali. Anazali. Ugh, my brain is so fuzzy today. Honestly, cheap, easy food is good. Let no one say otherwise. Anyone who says otherwise is, well, being a pompous jackass. There we go. Just have some other Anazali walking about, going about their day. Alright. So let's get some more detail going on this dude. Now we get to some fun. So, in terms of gender, I tend to like... The Anazali are a lot like us in the fact that their gender is a spectrum. And, you know, they do have the reproductive side of it, male, female, gametes, that kind of thing, that does exist. But, much like us, they have a lot of folks that are genderqueer, that are trans, in fact, probably a higher percentage than we do. In part because Anazali lived for so long, their concepts of gender identity often break down. And so, most Anazali, after a certain age, just don't really think about that. Like, it's not a really meaningfully defining part of them. Anazali that live long enough find you can experiment with damn near every part of your personality. And I think that's a part that's really hard for a lot of people to think about. But it's important. Let's see, I'm going to add shading to this. We're going to call this 45. There we go. God, it's not behaving for some reason there. Doesn't you realize it's not your truest self? Yeah, exactly. A lot of Anazali end up being particularly comfortable in their forms. And so, as a general rule of thumb, the Anazali are as close to, like... I would say, if you're looking for someone who's truly self-actualized in Legacy, a lot of the eldest Anazali fall into that. These are the sort of folks that have lived long enough to learn that if you're not true to yourself, then you're not living. And after a few thousand years, that kind of sets in pretty hard. In fairness, the Anazali also have another side of them which is kind of interesting. Just because Anazali don't die of old age doesn't mean they don't die. In fact, actually, it means that all Anazali deaths in the modern age are either as a result of accident or as a result of intention. And also, there's the fact that a large number of Anazali suffer from deaths of despair. That's kind of what tends to happen when your civilization implodes. Oops. Alright. Feels like we're going pretty good. Let's start getting some over levels here. So we need to start thinking about our Anazali's color scheme here. I'm thinking we're going to go for... I want something that's pretty indicative of most Anazali, so we're going to go with like a pale purple. Tends to be the color I use the most for them. Like almost a lavender or a lilac. Alright. Let's start picking out the parts of them that are immediately, easily, like, accessible. Gonna do this on normal. Here we go. Alright, let's start with the antlers. Almost all Anazali have this crown. And the crown often defines the way the rest of their face looks. Much like our brow, in a lot of ways. It falls with the same sort of identity aspect of them. Your brow says a lot about how you look. Alright. Let's take this dude, sort of curve it up a little bit. I think also part of the whole Anazali's gender identity being very, like, fluid is in part because they've been genetically augmented from their original physiologies. The Anazali, like, have almost nothing, at least in terms of their original, like, species. Aesthetically speaking, they're very distinct from what they used to look like. And I think that just sort of comes from the ability to make yourself who you are. There's a point where you start editing what you want to be. And for the Anazali, they very quickly ran into that as a hurdle. Emotionally, psychologically, there's a lot of problems with being able to make yourself look exactly like you want. And so, there's nothing wrong with it. I think that it's a good thing, but taken to an extreme, you start to question, like, well, people can control exactly what they look like. How many people would often end up looking like the same caricature of a person? I think we see that occasionally with, like, types of cosmetic surgeries, where some people just sort of let themselves go ham. And then later they go, oh, I don't really like the way I look. And it's like, well, you should. You spent a small fortune to modify yourself exactly the way you chose. But the truth of the matter is that when you look like the way you want, you don't look like the way you there's no grounding element. There's no part of you that you have to come to terms with that you can really consider as anything but constructed. So the Anazali, having spent literally thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, genetically modifying themselves, tweaking themselves over and over again, I feel like because of their general aesthetics, they slowly became more androgynous. And so, as a result, many Anazali are, by, like, very clear definition, they would be gender queer or gender fluid. And not that there's anything wrong with that. Again, I think that's a good thing. And I think for most Anazali, they would also think it's a good thing. But it also does lead to a fair bit, I think, of dysphoria among their people. If only because a lot of them, especially the younger generations that weren't as culturally indoctrinated with the values of their elders, that are just like the survivors, they might not appreciate that for some of them, they were literally engineered to look the way they did. So basically, any of those scenes with Julian Bashir from Star Trek, I think that'd be a pretty good gauge of how some Anazali feel about themselves. Fantastic show, by the way. Deep Space Nine, can't recommend that enough. Here we go. And now we're going to add some upper detail onto this. There we go. So mechanically speaking, Anazali are an interesting species in Legacy. For starters, Anazali has some of the highest number of ranks for people to invest in proficiencies, which are kind of like life skills that are slowly earned over a long period of time. Think of these as your hobbies, your personal interests, things you've acquired as a result of collegiate or on-the-job training. The sort of things that take a long time to really hone. Anazali have a long time to hone them. However, probably their biggest ability, they do the same thing with disciplines. They have more discipline ranks than other species often get. And they're not assigned, so they can spread them where they want. But their biggest advantage is that once per session, they can spend a mode of legacy to just straight up turn to the GM and go, I would like some help. I would like some advice on how to proceed. They don't get mechanical dice help. They don't get bonuses, none of that, but the GM can deign to give them a little hint if they're stuck on a puzzle, or perhaps let them get a good read on the situation. I always thought of that as the Anazali literally being so old they've kind of seen everything under the sun a little bit. Or, metaphorically speaking, under multiple suns. And so they're kind of, not jaded, but practiced, I believe. They're used to things other species might find novel. And they probably encountered a fair bit of trauma in even the youngest Anazali's time. Most other species don't have to contemplate what it would be like to lose their homeworld. Anazali do every single day. Most species don't have to grapple with the infinite. It's an abstract at best, whereas the Anazali, there's a possibility that, very slim, but Anazali could theoretically live long enough to see the heat death of the universe so their species doesn't go extinct before then. No one else is going to have to worry about that. I'm not going to worry about the heat death of the universe. But an Anazali that lives long enough might. It's very aspirational, of course. It's very unlikely they would live that long. Accident or terrible other things usually happen to them long before then, but, well, you know how the phrase goes. You worry about the things that are the least practical. Now, Anazali have a very interesting jaw structure. Namely, their jaws are actually built almost kind of like they have an extra joint. So their mandibles aren't quite like Turian mandibles from Mass Effect, but instead, their mandibles kind of do this thing where they sit on the outside. And anyone who's ever had transmigratory jaw, TMJ, you'd be familiar with this experience, where your jaw pops out, or like a tendon slips in, and you feel yourself like you have a longer ability to extend your jaw, but closing and biting hurts. So that's because your jaw, actually your bone sort of slides around and some of your tendons can pop under there. For the Anazali, they actually have their jaw come up and attach to this second mandible system, which then also connects to an upper point. So kind of like almost like a ratchet, Anazali can snap their jaws open very wide, and namely, their mandibles and their sides can sort of open up, which gives a very wide jaw. Likewise, also, they don't have a nasal cavity like we do that comes up the front. Instead, their nasal cavity actually runs much like, a little bit like ours too, under the cheekbone, and it then slides up through the sinuses. So for them, their ability to smell actually comes from the side of their head, and their nostrils that run along the inside of this ridge. So they have nostrils basically here, roughly where our tear ducts are. They don't really have a sticking out nose in that capacity. And let's go in here, put this at like 25%, save. And then I tend to give them these, like, ropey kind of hair tendrils. A little bit Predator-like, honestly. But I kind of like the idea that other species would have developed similar structures like we would in similar conditions. For the Anazali, their hair is adapted from, like, basically skin tags, in the same way that ours are kind of adapted from the same sort of material, the keratin that's in our nails, things like that. The Anazali have the equivalent of hair for the same reasons, but they originally developed from an underwater species, and so, as a result, their hair is a little thicker, more resilient. It does, however, it does. They don't feel it, so it's not quite as bad as like Asari head tentacles, where it's like, oh yeah, that's just a skin, that's just a finger. Can't see the art, homie? Oh yes, thank you, appreciate you. Tendrils, appreciate you letting me know. So yeah, for a lot of the Anazali, that's kind of what their hair looks like a little bit. I know, I saw. Did it twice. You're good. I appreciate you, homie. Remember, there's a delay in transmission, so you're going to be dealing with it a little. Whenever I have an issue, it's going to be a moment. Okay, and let me just sort of cover the back of that up. That's looking pretty decent, actually. Yeah, I'm liking that so far. And again, we're going to have a bunch of text and such hovering over this. I should have a blocking area. So yeah, that's exactly what I was hoping for. That the Anazali would slot right into that perfect hole. Love it. Great stuff. Makes me very pleased. And let's make sure we have the right text here. I'm just going to go in here and grab this text. We're going to go over here and paste without format. There we go. Nice. Beautiful. I'm really liking how that's turning out. The format's been very convenient, I'm not going to lie. We're going to save that. I want to do something fun with their clothing, because they're Anazali, and Anazali clothing is always very over the top. It's meant to be. Also, I want to futz around a little bit with that. So hold on. Just make that all text. Turn that off. Cool. I want to kind of go in here. Grab this. I want to slightly change the proportions on it. Here we go. We're going to do the same thing with that. And... oh, that was a little too much. Count on. There we are. That's a little more in proportion for what I'm aiming for. Beautiful. So Anazali clothing is going to be kind of fun. Like I said, usually tends to fall under, like, a very sort of floofy, long, kind of flowing robe, as a general rule of thumb. They're almost elvish in their aesthetic. But I kind of like to think of it as elvish with a Star Trek sense of aesthetic. They're the guys who basically have been in space for so long, comfort's king. So all their atmosphere and all their equipment is really practical, but also really cozy. It's kind of like having a perfect onesie. Have you ever had a piece of clothing that you're so comfortable with you don't want to change it? Like when you were a kid you would just find every excuse possible to wear the same damn thing over and over again. That's basically Anazali Atmosphere, but as a matter of design. So we've got this. I really like the idea of going a step further. Let's take a look at some of our exterior stuff. Okay. Let me take a look at some of the adversaries and some of the other designs I've got. Here we go. We'll deal with these guys later. But they have a pretty good, like, heavy cloak kind of design that I really sort of like. I'm actually going to do this on a different layer. I just realized I don't want to put that over the Anazali's head. So that way I can sort of tweak it as I need. Okay, then we sort of take this down here a little bit. Now, Anazali have interesting forearms. Unlike ours, theirs kind of are built around almost like a flexible spine structure. So, basically, their forelimbs are... They can slightly bend along the... where we would consider our forearm. That can flex like our spine. Not nearly as much as our spine can, but it gives them a little bit of the ability to reach into strange spaces and grab stuff. Which is a very convenient little ability, you know, for some folks to have. I'm also going to pop over here. We're going to take a look at some of the other designs I've got. This is a little more of a practical suit. Little Han Solo in that one, but a fun one. Also built a little bit off of the design of some of the clothing from Hero Forge. Actually, I really liked the... There's like one particular set they had that I was like, oh, that actually works pretty well. There's one final one, which is Orin. And you've already seen a clip of him earlier. The director of the Voyager program, actually. Which is pretty important. So the Anazali, as a species, were deposed in part because of what was really just a sad, stupid accident on the part of the Anazali. They didn't mean to destroy the galaxy, they just kind of led to it. Mostly through their horrible policies prior. But in this instance, this is something they really couldn't have possibly predicted. They were exploring the edge of the galaxy and found a life form known as the Ataraxy Scourge. The Ataraxy Scourge are unique in the fact that, unlike other species, they are a true hive mind entity, connected by quantum entanglement. Literally, their brains act like one giant nervous system across the entire species. When they encountered them, the Ataraxy Scourge had more or less settled down into their own little edge of the galaxy civilization. They hadn't really done anything. In fact, it seemed like they had made themselves their own little quiet corner, turning a little planet into a perfect ecosystem. And the Anazali didn't know what they were dealing with. And the Ataraxy slowly woke up, realized that there was another life form, and in its knee-jerk reaction decided that there shouldn't be. Nothing else should exist besides it. Anything else is a potential risk to its long-term survival. Thus, it began to eradicate the Anazali who were part of the research team. Fleeing, they thought they had escaped, but it turns out it clung to their ship and went with them. See every space outbreak movie and series you can imagine. It goes pretty bad. It goes pretty bad, pretty quick. And before the Anazali knew it, all the different client species that they had under their auspice had already been annihilated. Having been denied the ability to develop their own technological directions, it meant that basically by consuming an Anazali ship, the Ataraxi Scourge had pretty much negated all of the potential threats of every other client species who depended on Anazali-centric technology. No one had any technological diversity. And as a result, when the Ataraxi, a species that literally can disassemble you with a touch and absorb all your data, all of it, the entirety of everything you've ever known, technology, memory, scientific achievement, and incorporate it effortlessly into their massive hive mind. A hive mind that simply does not view us as sapient life. You have a problem. The Anazali didn't escape. They effectively died. Their civilization died with that. But while they did accidentally unleash the Ataraxi Scourge, their uplifting the Acris saved the galaxy. Or what's left of it. And, in the modern era, the Anazali are desperate to try to do right by the galaxy that they believe their ancestors screwed up. I like to think of the Anazali as a study in what happens in regret. If anyone wants to play an Anazali, there's a couple themes you might want to consider playing around with. What it means to be mortal. What it means to live with others. The actual impact of time. Truly the impact of time. What it means to be yourself. How to grapple with a history of cultural struggle and cultural oppression. Me personally, the Anazali, to me, kind of ended up being this way for me to explore a deep anxiety of my own. I'm Puerto Rican. And for those of you who don't know, Chris Columbus did a lot of bad stuff in the Caribbean. Like, a lot of bad stuff. And in fact, actually, it's hard for me to tell. Like, I don't know whether my grandmother and her grandparents... I knew my grandmother moved to Puerto Rico when she was young. But I don't know whether or not her parents came from Puerto Rico, whether they actually had cultural ties to the island. I don't know whether they might have even gone back as far as the Taino. But it wasn't until I started doing a little digging into Puerto Rico that I realized I didn't know the actual faces of the people that the Spanish had persecuted in the Caribbean until I encountered them in Puerto Rico, until I saw the Taino people. That's a pretty heavy topic. And it took a while. I'm still grappling with it myself, if I'm being completely honest. I don't think I've ever reached an answer about how I feel about that. How my people as Hispanics are both victims of colonialism in South America and also perpetrators of colonialism in South America and the Caribbean. It's a strange thing to consider. And I genuinely believe the Anazali are one of those species that are a great way to explore what it means to come to terms with the darker parts of your personal ancestry and history. What it means to define yourself in spite of your legacy maybe being somewhat, well, messed up. What does it mean to be the children of people who've done wrong? And what do you do to try to make right? I kind of want to do a bright color on this. So I'm going to open the color wheel, and we're just going to Roy G. Biv this. Okay. So Roy G. Biv, I believe that is a 7. So that's a 7. That's a 7-sided die, which I do not possess. So I will simply roll a D8, for I have many. Yeah. All right. Let's take a moment and roll it out. So 1 will be red, 2 will be orange, 3 will be yellow, 4 green, 5 blue, 6 indigo, 7 violet, and 8 I roll again. Okay, that's a 3. So we're looking at gold. Interesting. So, fun fact. The Anazali have glowing eyes in part because of their genetic tinkering. Turns out that having backlit eyes actually gives you some advantages in certain low light conditions. So, not entirely unlike cats, which have their super reflective back of their eyeballs, but also on top of that, it gives them a unique edge in case they're ever spaced. With reflective eyes like that, they can be seen in dark lighting conditions. Furthermore, it's also aesthetically pleasing to the Anazali. Their eyes, on the other hand, their sclera, which is the white of your eye, it's actually black because, in no small part, they actually engineered that. It gives them some radiation resistance. So that'll do. Let's get in there and make that a little brighter. There we go. That feels like a pretty good bit of work. We've already got the basis of this sketch down. So I'd say keep an eye out, Voyagers, because in the next few days, you're going to start seeing some of these pieces appear on Discord, as we talk about the different species in greater detail, as well as also on my Patreon. Huge thanks, by the way, to my incredible patrons at Tier 1, Ampersand, Atlas, and Heinrich, at Tier 2, Necronomus and Souls Rolls, and Tier 3, Mossy the Mighty, currently in chat right now. Huge thank you, homie. And if you really are interested in seeing Legacy First Flight as it continues to develop, my Faster Than Light Tale in the World of Tomorrow, Indie TTRPG, or you want to support my webcomics, patreon.com/TheLastOmnitect. If you follow it for free, you get access to a bunch of stuff that I'm not going to post anywhere else. But if you subscribe, you get access to my webcomics 2 weeks before everyone else. You gain access to free beta test materials as they're produced. And you also get a couple of other perks that no one else is going to get. Thank you guys so much. You're all incredible. And to everybody else out there, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me today for a little stream of OMNI draws. The Anazali. I look forward to drawing more of this, but I'm going to do that off of stream. I hope you all have a good day. Take care. And I'll see you out there, Voyagers. Peace.